Hello, I'm John Perry, and welcome to Representative Gary Glenn Reports with Representative Gary Glenn.
John,
Representative,
good to see you again,
it's good
sir.
to see you. Oh, a lot of things to talk about today. First off, you have a very good update on your health.
I do, and I have, from the very beginning of this experience 18 months ago, been totally transparent because I believe my constituents have a right to know. But had very good news ever since my last chemotherapy treatment at the end of July of 2016. I've gone to the University of Michigan Cancer Center every 4 months to see the cancer doctors. And my wife and I went this past Monday. They said they now consider me stable. I've been in remission since 5 weeks after the diagnosis. So we went from stage 4 cancer to remission in 5 weeks. The PSA score went from 348 on January 15th to 1.1 5 weeks later. It has been below that ever since. It's been below that long enough now they consider me stable. So on Monday they told me don't coming back for a year. So praise the Lord, and thanks for all the prayers of people in Midland and Bay counties and elsewhere who kept my family and me in their prayers. And I certainly believe in the power of that, and we've got a good report. And so very happy about that. Just even in the hardest times, I stayed on the job, never missed a caucus or a committee meeting or a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives, even while going through 5 months of chemo, and you remember those days. But that's behind me. I feel much better now, and as confirmed by what I was told by the doctors on Monday, have taken a turn for the better and intend to continue to do the job that people of Bay and Midland counties elected me to do.
And people who follow you on social media will see that you're doing things like Relay for Life events, a couple of different places around the state.
Well, I've been asked the Isabella and the Vassar area Relays for Life, the local American Cancer Society chapters, asked me to speak, and so I did, and told them about my cancer survival story. So when they have the cancer survivor lap, I get to take the lap. And my story seems to offer hope to others, and I met people who offered hope to me. And there's always somebody else worse off. However bad it is, somebody else always has it or had it worse. I met a lady in Vassar the other day who had been through chemo 3 times. Once was enough. I would not want to wish that on anybody. And goodness, to have a child go through that, knowing what it feels like, having gone through it, that would be unbearable. But then I meet other people who've been through it, far tougher circumstances than I have. Just grateful to be in the position that I'm in, and again, very thankful for the prayers of all the folks who kept me and my family in mind over the last 18 months.
Here at the Capitol, you have a couple of pieces of legislation that have been under consideration in committee that in fact are, as we sit here today, just about ready to be reported, sent to the full House. What bills are we talking about there?
As we sit here today, I expect 2 different bills to be approved by 2 different committees next week that I introduced. One of them I expect to come out of the Military and Veterans Affairs Committee. It is a gun rights piece of legislation, but it simply codifies or makes permanent what is the current policy under the current Adjutant General, General Vadnais, under Governor Rick Snyder, the Commander-in-Chief of the National Guard here in Michigan. So it would apply to the 40-some training facilities and recruiting offices that are under the direct jurisdiction of the state National Guard and Governor Snyder and General Vadnais, and will say that military personnel and civilians will continue to be protected in their right to carry a concealed weapon if they have a permit on military facilities. That is current policy. This will simply make it a matter of law so that that protection of your Second Amendment rights is not in any way eroded or restricted under a future Adjutant General. So that has strong bipartisan support. In fact, I believe it is co-sponsored by every member of the Military and Veterans Affairs Committee, save 2, but with Republican and Democrat support.
Bipartisan.
And for example, Representative Brian Elder from Bay City has told me he wants to speak on the floor in support of the legislation. So I expect it to come out with strong bipartisan support. I would expect it would be passed by both the House and the Senate. And we've been given reason to believe by the State Military Division that the governor will sign this particular piece of gun rights legislation into law. It might be the only piece of gun rights legislation he signs into law, but that's one bill I feel very strongly about. I think it's a baby step, honestly, in the wake of the shootings at the Chattanooga recruiting office 2 or 3 years ago, I introduced legislation to follow the lead of 10 other states that actually required that members of the military be armed in any military facility that is open to the public. And under the Obama administration, they were going exactly the opposite way. We can't affect at the state level the policy for military facilities under federal jurisdiction where there's a prohibition on soldiers being armed while on base and capable of defending themselves. So you see what happened in Fort Hood and what happened in the recruiting offices down in Chattanooga. But this is at least a modest step in the right direction to make sure that gun rights and the concealed carry rights are protected for those who already have them, that they can't be taken away in the future. The other bill is I also expect to have strong bipartisan support. I had about equally Republican and Democrat co-sponsors, in this case all female, of a piece of legislation that I think sends a strong message in regards to human trafficking and protection of women who are victims of human trafficking, who may be involved in prostitution. But Michigan is the only state in the country now, according to the University of Michigan Human Trafficking Clinic, in which police officers are exempt from prosecution if they actually have sex with a prostitute or victim of human trafficking while conducting an undercover operation. It was not intended to be that way. Nobody believes that the legislature actually intended to give that blanket exemption. But the way the law is written, we are the only state that still provides that exemption. And there's no evidence that any police officer has actually engaged in sexual activity with a prostitute or victim of human trafficking and then tried to use this exemption from prosecution to evade prosecution. But the director of the UM Human Trafficking Clinic says that men who impersonate police officers are aware of the exemption and use it to intimidate women into having sex. And so we're just going to, as a statement of principle, have an exception to that exemption from prosecution to say that a police officer cannot actually engage in sex with a prostitute or victim of human trafficking and be exempt from prosecution. So it's a clear signal, I believe, and it'll have strong bipartisan support to say that the state of Michigan, we in the state legislature, are going to take every step that we can that's at our disposal to protect women who are in these kind of vulnerable situations. I testified in front of the committee the other day along with Senator Emmons, who has been a champion of human trafficking legislation. She agreed to take the bill that I introduced in the House and introduced the same bill in the Senate, and it's already passed the Senate unanimously, Republican, Democrat, unanimously. That's a pretty strong statement. So I expect those bills to come out of committee on Tuesday, out of two different committees with strong bipartisan support, and I expect both of them will eventually become law, be signed by Governor Snyder. So those are, good examples in an environment in which there's a lot of conflict and division. Here are two good examples of bills that I was able to introduce that have won strong bipartisan support, and I have been committed to demonstrating that an elected official can be true to the convictions on which he or she ran for public office and win cooperation at the same time on a bipartisan basis. You don't have to choose between being effective and adhering to the principles, in my case, the conservative principles on which I told people in Bay and Midland counties that if they elected me, those were the kind of principles they could expect me to motivate my actions. So those are two great examples and two bills that I think will soon become law.
In terms of energy policy, earlier in May, you traveled over to Michigan's Thumb in your capacity as chair of the House Energy Policy Committee to listen to some of the residents over there about energy issues, specifically wind power, which has been a little contentious over at the tip of the thumb. It maybe underscores the point that your job as a chair isn't just in Lansing, but involves the entire state.
Well, that's true. We had a public hearing in which advocates and critics of wind power development in Michigan testified before us for 90 minutes. And then one of them suggested, would you be interested in coming to the Thumb? Because the Thumb has been the epicenter of this debate in the state of Michigan. Earlier in May, there were 20 different local jurisdictions, townships, counties that had questions about wind development ordinances on the ballot. And they were all rejected by a 2-to-1 vote in every single one. A reporter earlier this week pointed out that in 2000, roughly around 7 years ago, that there'd been a vote on the ballot in Huron County and it had passed 2-1. But 5, 6, 7 years later, it's on the ballot in 20 jurisdictions and fails 2-1. Well, the only explanation I could give is that having actually been through the experience by a 2-1 majority, those who turned out to vote said the experience we just went through wasn't positive. I told and by the way, Ingersoll Township in Midland County and another township, I think Hope Township, had hearings on this recently. Neither of those is in my legislative district. They're represented by Representative Roger Houck, who is the vice chairman of the House Energy Committee. I serve as chairman. But it is coming to Midland County, at least in terms of early consideration. And I guess I would encourage anybody who faces this issue in their backyard, so to speak, they should research what has happened in other areas like the Thumb. I came away from that town hall meeting in Cairo with 2 major points. One is there were a lot of complaints about conflict of interest, that planning and zoning officials or township supervisors and trustees who had wind contracts, wind leases with wind development companies, were the ones who were voting on whether or not to approve ordinances that would allow those leases to come into effect, and there would be a direct financial benefit to them. Not a general benefit to the area or to the profession in which somebody happens to be involved, but a direct cash benefit if you approve the ordinance and then when development happens, if you already got a pre-existing wind lease, you get money. And there was a pretty broad sentiment that we've got to address that in some fashion. It just doesn't pass the smell test. Even though somebody may have been on the Planning Commission for several decades and has no intent, didn't get on there just for this purpose, it still doesn't look right. And there was also very strong testimony that when this issue comes to a community, it can be divisive. Family members on opposite sides, don't come back to church. No, you can't hunt on my land anymore. When a member of the school board from Sanilac County said, tell the governor and the legislature that as long as the state has this mandate, mandating that 15% of all energy generated in Michigan has to be from renewables, including wind, that we are dividing these communities. The social fabric of the communities is being torn. That got the biggest applause of the night. And I had been invited to do that by people who were concerned about the issue. We had about 200 people turn out. And I went over to the Thumb because that's been ground zero in the debate over wind power, because there are stronger winds over in the Thumb than there are in other parts of the state. And so you're right, in my capacity as chairman of the House Energy Policy Committee, that takes me all over Michigan in terms of researching. Somebody invited me yesterday to tour a propane plant, Senator Green in Tuscola County. I've toured the water facility over the very unique water facility Consumers has over on the West Coast near Muskegon. Have toured the plant down in Monroe County, the nuclear facility, Argonne National Laboratory in the Chicago area. So it has taken me to various places around the state so that I'm better informed about the issue. There is probably not another district in Michigan, more so than the one that I have the privilege of representing, to which the energy issue is critical. We have in the district that I represent the most valuable company in Michigan at $60.1 billion in stock value, Dow Chemical. And the single biggest cost of doing business for Dow Chemical is the cost of electricity. And right next to Dow Chemical, we have Midland Cogeneration Venture, which is the largest gas-powered steam and electricity producing facility in North America. And then, though it's not geographically in my district, a lot of people live in the area that I represent, work there. Hemlock Semiconductor is the single biggest consumer of electricity. So there are 1,500 area jobs in Bay and Midland County region that are dependent on their continued ability to compete against the Chinese in a world marketplace. So energy is an extremely critical issue. I am privileged to be in a position to have influence over that issue for the sake of the people that I represent and the economy in Bay and Midland counties. But it does take me outside the counties those two counties to learn and do the best job I can on that issue.
At the Capitol, most days I look up and see you there with a gavel in your hand as you preside over the Michigan House as the Associate Speaker Pro Tem. That's an important job. It's important that the House function in an orderly way and that members are recognized and listened to as they speak on behalf of their constituents.
Well, I happened to get a card in the mail this week from Midland Reformed Church, in which they said they had been praying for me. And one of the things they said they prayed for me about was that I would be held in good standing with my colleagues and would have influence with my colleagues. Well, the reason that I'm one of the 4 people in the House who can run the House, be in the Speaker's chair, is because my colleagues voted me into that position. So yeah, that's a degree of comfort and trust that they put in me. And I think if you talk to Republican or Democrat, they would find that when I'm in the chair that they've been treated very fairly. But what that says to the people of Bay and Midland counties is that I've tried to do the best job I could to be effective, to be consistent, to adhere to the principles I promised them I would advocate if they elected me, but to do so in such a way that I do not alienate my colleagues, but in fact win the trust of my colleagues. And so again, it is a privilege, a blessing to be entrusted with a leadership position and do my best to be fair. But it is an interesting perspective to be in the Speaker's chair, to be conducting the business of the day, and very grateful for that opportunity. I hope it makes the people in Bay and Midland counties proud that the guy that they've sent to represent them in Lansing is trusted enough by his colleagues on both sides of the aisle to be entrusted with running the House of Representatives, the business of the House. And I know we had several, if I remember correctly, from Plymouth Elementary in Midland that visited a couple of weeks ago, and I was running the House of Representatives from the Speaker's chair. So I'm the one that got to introduce them, etc. So they didn't have to search around on the floor for their state representative. They could see me right up at the top on the raised platform running the business of the House. And that was a pretty cool experience when I got to introduce them and from the Speaker's chair.
Representative, we're going to take a break right now, but we'll be back with Representative Gary Glenn Reports right after this. And we're back with Representative Gary Glenn. Representative, your Common Core legislation, we've talked about that in the past. Where does it stand?
Multiple hearings in the Competitiveness Committee in the House of Representatives, continuing to work with other representatives across the state and address their concerns, but that remains a priority for me, and I know other members of House leadership, so that hasn't passed yet. May not pass before we break for a in-district work period coming up in the summer, but it continues to be a priority for me, just simply along the principle that every child in Michigan ought to have access to the best quality education that we're capable of providing. And as we look around the country for what standards we should apply to ensure every child has access to a high-quality education, in my opinion, we should pick those standards that have been rated by test results to produce the highest scores for students. In both, in the case of the Massachusetts standards, they were fourth grade reading, 8th grade math, college and career readiness. The Massachusetts standards ranked #1 in the nation in every category. So why not the best for Michigan students? We're going to continue to pursue that principle, but just want to assure those who care about that issue that we're not letting that go just because the legislative process works slowly sometimes.
You know, Representative, unfunded pension liabilities are a significant issue for public schools in our state, for local government agencies in our state. Along those lines, you're working on legislation. The whole House is looking at those issues. When it comes to local governments, you have legislation in hand. What does it do?
Well, I met with about 60 firefighters and police officers in Midland County before the turn of the year, before Christmas. And one of the things that they pointed out was, it wasn't their fault that perhaps that the retirement benefit funds haven't been fully funded by the local governments that offered them. And they said, why don't you require by state law that if you're going to offer the retirement benefit, you have to fully fund it? Unfortunately, we can't be retroactive with that type of law. We can only say from this day forward. And so I am drafting and will introduce legislation that says that any unit of local government that offers a certain retirement benefit must fund it. Number one, that's fair to the employees who are getting the promise of that benefit. If it is not funded, it puts at risk the local government's ability to provide what they promised, and then it flows uphill by the Michigan State Constitution to the responsibility of the state, which means the state taxpayers have to pay for some unit of local government's failure to adequately and responsibly fund a benefit that they offered. So from this day forward, the legislation would say that if you're going to offer a benefit, pay for it. If you can't pay for it, don't offer it. Don't expect the state to bail you out. And I had a meeting last night in which it was communicated to me that the governor is interested in that very piece of legislation to make sure this doesn't happen in the future. So I have reason to believe that if we can get it crafted correctly, we'll know from the beginning that it's something the governor's willing to sign into law. We're also going to address, most likely, maybe even in the next several weeks, the question of protecting teacher retirement because the current teacher retirement system is in such a condition. It's $30 billion upside down, which means eventually it's going to collapse and the promises made to teachers will not be fulfilled. So we've got to address the situation. It's a tough vote, costs a lot of money over the next 40 years, but if we don't do it, it only gets worse. And over half of the teachers teach for less than 10 years, which is the vesting period for the current pension system, which means that 50% of the people who go into the classroom leave the classroom and never get a benefit. None of the money that was put in. If we shift to a 401k system, that money would be portable. All the money that the school district had put and the state had put into a 401k account would be theirs, their property, to take with them. So number one, we've got to protect the promises that have been made to teachers by making sure the system is financially viable into the future, into their retirement age, 30, 40, 50 years from now. Number two, we think it's a benefit to teachers if they have a system that's portable, so that if they do choose a different career, they can take the money with them. And just as a matter of fiscal responsibility, somebody's got to make the tough decisions to fix the system so that it is financially viable. Otherwise, we risk the the possibility at some point in the future that the pensions cannot be honored, cannot be paid. We saw that happen to some people down in Detroit. Don't want to see that happen to public school teachers across the state. So those are two issues that are tough, but because it flows uphill responsibility to the state, and then we have to share the burden among all taxpayers. So taxpayers who live in communities that have fully funded their benefits, for example, then being forced to bail out communities that didn't fully, local government officials, easy. Promise a benefit, don't fund it, figuring someday the state will bail us out. Well, the state is the people of Michigan, the taxpayers of Michigan. It's my job, I think, to protect taxpayers in Bay and Midland County from having to bail out some other area of the state where they had local government officials take the easy route and promise a benefit they then refuse to fund. So those are going to be some very important issues, and it's going to be to the tune of billions of dollars. And eventually, when the teacher pension system is restructured over the course of the next several decades, eventually it will free up additional billions of dollars that are now being spent on the pension fund that would then flow into the classroom to perhaps hire more teachers or to enhance the educational experience of children in the classroom. I think that's what everybody would agree they'd want to see be the final result.
And laterally and over from that, it is budget time at the state capitol in Lansing. Looking ahead, it looks as though, speaking of public schools, that the Midland schools could see a nice benefit in the fiscal year 2018 budget that's under consideration.
The budget has not yet been finalized, but it does appear that something that started in the Midland Public Schools offices with former school board superintendent or chairman Jerry Wasserman and Superintendent Mike Sharrow, and that was the concept, the at-risk money that in the past has been allocated only to districts with a certain percentage of children who meet the at-risk definition under the federal law, the free lunch program, for example, and money which the Midland Public School District has never received. About 1 out of 4 students in the Midland Public School System meets the definition, but that wasn't high enough for Midland and about 50 other districts to ever having received any of this money. Jerry Wasserman proposed the principle, however, that you don't have at-risk districts, you have at-risk students, and it doesn't matter where they live. If they're in that financial situation, their families are, and they are at risk. It's 1 out of 4. So Jerry simply said the money ought to follow the child, not the school district. If the child's at risk, ought to be the beneficiary of some of that money. So it appears, I got a certain degree of distance my first term, a little further the second term. It would have received some funding that Midland County would have benefited from, or Midland Public Schools. In the second year, except for a revenue shortfall that the last minute required leaving some budgetary expenditures on the floor, in the cutting room floor. But this year, the governor put it in his proposal. And so I can't at this point predict exactly what the dollar amount is. In the governor's proposal, it would have been $1.5 million to Midland Public Schools that they had never received before. In the House-approved budget, it would be $800,000. Somewhere between, or at least some figure, it looks like in the next budget year, Midland Public Schools, as a result of others being willing to stand with me on that issue, that the Midland Public Schools will receive that funding for the first time ever. And it'll be a big deal. We'll announce, when the budget is finally passed, we'll be able to announce the exact figure, but in addition to, I believe it's a $50 per student increase for all students generally, I believe Midland Public Schools is finally going to get its share of this at-risk money to be used for at-risk children. And that'll be a substantial amount of money that they've never had the benefit of having to help those children in the past. So that will be a big deal for Midland Public Schools in particular.
Finally, Representative, you are busy in the district. You're honoring some local Boy Scouts. You're planning to meet with some constituents a little later on in the month of June. There's a lot going on at home, too.
Yes, I've had the privilege in just the last several weeks of being at the Courts of Honor for 4 different Eagle Scouts. All 4 of them happened to be in Auburn, that part of Bay County that I represent near Bay City Western. My son graduated from Bay City Western, and I think all 3 of the Eagle Scouts whose Court of Honor I attended this past Sunday were Bay City Western guys, and so it's certainly one of the more pleasant things that I enjoy. I was an Eagle Scout, or as I say, once an Eagle, always an Eagle. I am an Eagle Scout. My wife and I are Annette and I are the parents of 4 Eagle Scouts. Annette has been on the troop committee, did her wood badge training, was a Cub Master. So our family's had a strong history of scouting. So as an Eagle Scout and the father of 4 Eagles, I get invited very often to be at Eagle Courts of Honor, and it's very much something that I enjoy. We've done that. We're going to have not town hall meetings, but office hours in Auburn and Pinconning in late June, and those will be advertised. In fact, I hope we can put them up on the screen here, the dates and locations, and invite people in those portions of Bay County who want to come have a one-on-one conversation with me to come do so, and make myself available right there in their own community, in their local city halls in most cases, so that if there's a problem, many times people have a private problem, an unemployment claim, or a health-related issue with Medicaid, where they'd like to speak to their state representative personally and privately. We try to accommodate that, and then also, if there's nobody who wants to speak privately, we can talk as a group. But nonetheless, that's part of my job that I enjoy, and look forward to talking to people over the summer who have any kind of issue that they need to address with their state government.
Okay. Representative Gary Glenn, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Good talking to you, and I'm John Perry. Thank you for joining us.